Nurses are exposed to the transience of life on a weekly basis, sometimes experiencing unnerving occurrences which give them glimpses into the spiritual realm. With many people reaching their end in hospital on any given day, there is sure to be some paranormal activity, and over time there have been many reports of ghosts and spirits being witnessed. These scary events often occur to night shift workers when the hospital may be short-staffed and much quieter, and given that the so-called witching hour, thought to be around 3 a.m. to 4 a.m., is reputed to be a time when strange phenomena are more likely to happen. Here are some unnerving accounts that have been shared by actual nurses. Surgeon's apparition. Melinda is a specialised nurse working in a hospital operating room. One evening, she was called in to assist with a serious case in the operating room and was in the thick of it. She and her team were in the middle of demanding procedures when she saw the figure of a man in surgeon's garb walk past the operating room door. Her eyes followed him as he continued on towards a dead end, as the room was situated at the end of the hall. Melinda quickly walked to the door and could not see anyone. She yelled out hello, and eerily, still there was no one there. She had heard that there was a ghost of a former deceased surgeon in the operating room, and now she had seen him. Laughing child. Kari reports that she was once eating alone in the cafeteria during her night shift at around 1 a.m. She walked out to the hall to take the elevator back to her ward and heard a small child laughing. No one was anywhere around, with the area seemingly deserted. She asked security to patrol around and search for any possible source of the laughter. However, there was only the Environmental Services Department down at the end, with the doors locked and nowhere near that hallway. Angels at their side. Henry worked for some time in a residential hospice facility. It was well known that often, before one of their residents would pass away, many of the staff nurses would observe a small child, sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, playing in the corridor. He says that the timing of the sighting was never consistent. Sometimes it would be just minutes before the final breath, and sometimes it would be hours or days, but always it was known that that person's time had come. Seeing the child was really frightening, except that the staff knew it was something paranormal. Instead, the whole place had a peaceful feel and was not usually scary. He says that often patients would talk about angels at their side. Once they had a nun as a patient, and when she passed, they heard singing. The staff checked all the rooms to see if there was a choir on TV, but they found nothing to explain the sound. Claire reported the spirit of another nun called Mary, whose presence resulted in the closing of room 12 in her hospital's intensive care unit. Nearly every patient who had been in the room since Mary passed had complained of seeing a woman wearing a white habit, rocking back and forth at their bedside. It seemed this phantom nun never made eye contact, but just stared over their heads and beyond them out of the window, which happens to be on the patient's left side. This particular window overlooks the hospital cemetery where deceased nuns were buried. Mary is known to be a nun who died in a car accident outside the hospital back in the 1950s. She was only about 30 years of age, and all the patient witnesses described her as a young woman. After all these unnerving encounters, room 12 became the hospital's storage room, where no one enters by themselves unless it is absolutely essential. Pippins' visit. Alana had a patient who was very ill and quite obviously very close to the end. The week before, Alana's best buddy cat Pippin had died, and she was still quite broken up about it. Strangely, when she walked into this patient's room, she exclaimed, "Oh, you've brought your kitty with you." Alana blinked at her and replied, "What?" She explains that this was the first time she had cared for that patient, and she hadn't discussed her cat with her, having cats, nor even liking them. The patient responded, "Your kitty, it's right by your foot." Alana felt momentarily stunned, with a small shiver going through her. Impulsively, she asked the woman, "Really, what colour is the kitty?" She replied, "Black with some white." Pippin had been a black tuxedo cat, having white paws and a white bib. Perhaps she was coming to help, as the patient passed away that night. 6 p.m. Over the course of Steve's nursing career, he says that he has experienced the passing of numerous patients, but remembers this one in particular due to the strange circumstances. A few months back, a terminally ill man who had been suffering from leukemia for several years began rapidly declining in health. One evening at around supper time, he became increasingly anxious and stated that he had to get ready because they were coming to get him at 6 p.m. A few minutes later, Steve checked on the man's status again and found that he had passed away at virtually 6 p.m. on the dot. An empty room. Recently, Marianne heard a creepy story about the hospital in which she works. One section of the hospital has been rebuilt and faces onto her unit. A nurse who was doing something near the window looked across and saw two people moving around in one of the clinic rooms. She thought it strange because it was then after hours and the clinic was shut. She called over a colleague who also observed these two people. They called security, who went over to investigate and checked out the room. There was nobody there. Sometime later, the nurses again spotted these two people moving around in the locked clinic, so they again called security. This time, the security guards split up. One stayed with the nurses, while the other man went over to the clinic to check once more. The totally chilling aspect of this situation was that the security guards were talking on the radio. The man in the clinic stated that the room was empty, but the other security guard, standing in Marianne's unit with the two nurses and looking out through the window, could actually see these two people. Creepily, they were standing right next to the security guard while he was talking. Vivid hallucinations. Ryan has worked as a night nurse for 4 years at an elderly person's home. At this stage, he was caring for a palliative patient who couldn't sleep because of intensely vivid hallucinations. She would describe to him seeing voodoo people around her room who she said would just stare at her, waiting for her to die. Ryan did not take it seriously until a woman staying across the hall, who rarely ever spoke, started seeing them in her own room as well. This disclosure gave him major shivers. Other sinister presences have been seen. One night, Marianne was assisting a dying male patient who seemed very scared. She spent a lot of time with him, trying to calm and reassure him. Eventually he relaxed, and she left his bedside and returned to the nurse's station, which was a short distance away. As she sat down, she glanced over to him and was terrified to see a black shape standing over his bed, looking down at him. She is sure it was some kind of evil presence. Ruby states that every hospital she has worked in has at least one ghost. Years ago, she worked at an old hospital which was scheduled for demolition. The nurses had just moved into their brand new tower, but several wanted to walk through the old unit for one last time. As they wandered past what had once been the large men's ward, they saw two figures in what should have been a completely empty space. One of Ruby's co-workers looked in to investigate and immediately backed out, her face as white as a sheet. Now curious, Ruby also peeked in, but all she saw was two older men perched on an old bed and chatting. Her co-worker explained that the men were Bill and Larry, who had been frequent flyers in the ward. Both had been considered quite annoying patients when they were alive, which they were not anymore. She said they had been rumoured to still be lingering around the ward, but no one had actually witnessed them this blatantly.